Chapter 2. It's almost noon. Greg Rescue looked impatiently at his watch and then at Frank Cox, who sat beside him on the steps of the clock tower inside Sora. They should have been here 2 hours ago. We've looked all over town for them, Frank said. Do you want to take another ride around? Greg shook his head. They'll expect us to wait here. But it's strange. Nobody at the youth hotel remembers seeing them there last night. Let's give them another half an hour. Greg nodded and watched 2 small boys chase each other down the narrow street. He was worried about Lisa and Debbie too, of course. In the short time they've known each other, he learned that Lisa kept her promises. He also knew the girls were getting short of cash and didn't want to wire the parents for more, so they were counting on driving with Frank and him. Without them, Lisa and Debbie would probably hitchhike, and he didn't like them doing that. He really liked Lisa. He wanted to see a lot of her when they got home to Los Angeles. Here, she'd been living her whole life in Pasadena, about 20 miles away from his house, and he had come to Europe to meet her. The half hour passed, and Frank was looking worried. What should we do? We can't just go off and leave them. How about if we go down the main highway? Greg got up. That's the road they were taking to get here. Maybe they had to camp along the way last night. They got into Frank's MG and drove through the gates of the old walled town, watching the road or sight of the girls or places where they might have camped for the night. Their blue little car drove smoothly. Frank had bought it second-hand in England at the beginning of the trip and planned to have it shipped back to L.A. It was great that Frank had such a big allowance, making this tour of Europe by bus, or maybe by hitchhiking. He looked across at his friend, big and blonde and tanned, heavier than Greg, but not quite as tall. They had known each other for years and had been friends all that time. Maybe because they were such opposites. Greg was dark and skinny, and his family had very little money, but he made good grades easily all through school, while Frank had to work hard for C's. Now they were both sophomores, sharing a room at UCLA, and Greg was spending long hours coaxing Frank trying to keep him there. They didn't see Lisa and Debbie. When they finally had to admit the girls were nowhere near Sayasora, they decided to drive on to Bucharest, walking out for them as they drove. They saw the little village in the afternoon, the spire of its church shining above the meadows. "It's off the main road," Frank said, "but I'm hungry. Want to stop there?" "Sure. Maybe they've got a pizza place," Greg said wistfully. "Right on. Or a McDonald's." The countryside around them was farmland, in the foothills of the Carpathians, green and gold the August sunlight. They passed small wooden houses shaded by trees, and tables were set under the trees where men in loose, long-sleeved shirts and women in colorful skirts sat eating, their children running bare-legged around them. Greg wondered briefly if he would be sitting here like they were now if his father hadn't immigrated to California 30 years ago. His uncle's house was in Rupia, where they had visited the day before, was much like those they passed, a little bigger perhaps, and they had seemed to be full of relatives. He had met 7 cousins, 2 of them almost his age. They had seemed unsophisticated compared with people back home, but happy with their lives and curious about his. They had teased him about his beard and long dark hair and called him a hippie. The MG was on the main street of the village now, passing the church they had seen from the road. "Seen anything that looks like a restaurant?" Frank was saying. Greg shook his head. There wasn't much to the village, but a few stores and houses. "We should try the inn there." He pointed to a big building on the corner of the street, bearing a sign with a picture of a black horse with the word "No Pate." But Frank was looking at a car parked in front of the building. "An Alfa Romero. I want to take a look at that baby." He pulled up behind it, and both of them got out to admire the silver sports car, a new Alfa Romero, sleekly upholstered in navy blue leather seats and carpeting. Its dashboard gleaming. Greg leaned over for a closer look at the gauges and switches. Then he saw the crumpled piece of paper lying on the floor on the passenger side. It looked familiar. He reached for it and picked it up, smoothing it between his fingers. What have you got there?" Frank watched him curiously. So Greg held out to him a Hershey bar wrapper. "Lisa!" "Yeah," Greg said, feeling relief. "Looks like we found out where they got to." "Maybe not." Frank handed the wrapper back to Greg, who put it in his pocket, not quite knowing why. There must be 100 million of those around. "In Romania? How many Hershey bars have you seen here?" "Well, looks like they might be at the inn. Let's go see." The place looked odd. The carpeting in the lobby showed patches of wear, and the furniture antique. Behind a wooden counter, rows of keys hung on wooden pegs. Beyond the lobby, the sunlight streaked through the open windows, and Greg could see the dining room where several people were eating. He hesitated. Maybe Lisa and Debbie wouldn't want to see them. Maybe they decided they didn't want to continue on to Budapest with him and Frank, but just hadn't told them so. Maybe they wouldn't even be here. He seemed like too much of a coincidence that they would put up beside a very car that Lisa had driven in. Lisa and Debbie had been going through this part of the country yesterday, certainly trying to get a ride. But there wasn't that many cars on the road. The Alfa Romero had been just around the only car they'd seen in the village. They passed through the lobby and stood at the entrance to the dining room, studying those inside, but the girls were not there. "Do you think they took rooms here?" Frank said. Frank shook his head. "Not as broke as they were. They barely had food money left." "Then what now?" "Let's try to find that guy who owns the Alpha. Maybe he dropped them off somewhere." They went back to the lobby, and Frank went to the counter and rang the little bell on its top. Almost immediately, a middle-aged man wearing a neat, dark suit appeared, smiling at them. Frank spoke to him in English. "Would you tell me who owns the Alfa Romero parked just outside?" Surprisingly, the man nodded. "The car belongs to Gino Bathory, who owns this inn." Then he raised a questionary eyebrow. "We'd like to see him," Frank exclaimed. "I'm sorry, sir. He's not here right now. He will be back in a short time. Then we'll have something to eat and wait for him," Rick said. In the dining room, they ate a stuffed cabbage dish among the chattering patrons, all of whom seemed to be Romanians. But they were finished. They went back to see the man at the desk, who shook his head at them. "No, he has not yet arrived." He looked apologetic, then brightened. If you would like, you may wait in his office." Frank looked at Greg. "Think we should? It's getting late." "Yeah, I think we better talk to him." Greg was feeling worried. That Hershey bar must have been dropped in the car by Lisa. He was sure of it. And even if she didn't want him to, he had to ease his own mind by finding out where she and Debbie had gone. The man beckoned them beyond the counter and led them through the doorway and down a short, dark hall, and then unlocked another door. The office was small and very neat, with a leather couch and several chairs, a small and dark one with the wall lined with bookshelves. The clerk left them with a promise to inform Mr. Bathory that they were waiting the moment he came in, and closed the door behind him. "He'll probably think we flipped out," Frank said, dropping into a chair. "Pardon me, sir, What have you done with that girl who dropped the candy wrapper in your car?" Greg laughed. "We followed this trail of candy wrappers all across the continent, trying to locate the missing heirs to the Hershey's millions." Leaning against one of the bookshelves, holding an imaginary magnifying glass, hoping he was giving an impression of Sherlock Holmes. "Oh, how about this approach?" Frank leaned forward in his chair, pretending to be holding a microphone. "If you can produce the girls who dropped the candy wrapper within 30 seconds, you will receive the brand new genuine washer and dryer combination that will wash and dry you in one simple operation." "You'll probably boot us out of here in one simple operation." Greg scanned the bookshelves. "Hey, there's a guy who reads a lot of weird books, mostly about Dracula. Look, looks like he picked a few from the shelf and read their titles. Vampires Throughout the Ages, The Kingdom of Dracula, Castle Dracula. Why not? He's the guy who made Transylvania famous." "Yeah, but these books are unusual." Greg lifted another off the shelf, a small volume bound in rich leather. The cover is held together by a clasp. He opened it and flipped the pages. They seemed to be handwritten, not printed. "Look at this one." He brought it to Frank, who studied it. "Dracula's Boyhood." It's written in English. Some of them are. Seems to be old, too, judging by the faded ink and the yellow paper. He handed it back to Greg, who sat down, was reading the first page, when they heard a muffled, angry voice from outside the door, and it flung open. The man who entered was dark-haired, about 25, and obviously annoyed, and Greg suddenly felt embarrassed about being there. But there was no way to back out now. The man spoke to them curtly. "Strangers are not usually allowed in my private office. It seems my new employee did not realize that." He crossed briskly to his desk and sat down beside it. "He tells me you were looking for the owner of the Alfa Romero. What may I do for you?" Greg looked at Frank, who was looking at him. So he spoke. He'd been traveling with two girls from California for the last few days, and were to meet them here inside Soy this morning. They never showed up. We know they must have passed this way yesterday, hitchhiking, probably. And as we walked by your car, we noticed a candy wrapper on the floor. The one of them might have dropped here. Gino Bathory's face was stiffened, growing pale, and Greg suddenly knew that this wasn't a crazy idea after all. This man had seen the girls, but he was sitting there, saying nothing, looking down at the dark wooden top of his desk. Frank broke the silence, sounding embarrassed. "We thought you might have given them a lift, and could tell us where you dropped them." Still not looking up, Gino shook his head, but Greg noticed that his brisk business-like manner and gone. And when he finally spoke, his voice was apologetic. "I cannot help you. I'm sorry. I have not seen any hitchhiking girls." He stood up and at last looked at them. "Now, if you will excuse me," Frank and Greg stood up too, but at the door, Greg turned. "But the candy wrapper." "Come on, Greg." Frank tugged at his arm. Greg stood his ground. Man behind the desk shrugged carelessly. "I might have dropped it there myself." "What kind of candy bar do you eat?" Greg said. Juno's eyes wavered. Then he smiled. "Or it could have been dropped by any of the young ladies I've taken out on occasion." "Who can tell? A candy wrapper, after all." His smile grew broader as he spread his hands in a gesture that showed him a small matter of a candy wrapper it was. "Good afternoon, gentlemen." Greg followed Frank down the corridor, past the clerk at the desk, who smiled weakly at them, and out of the front door. And when they were seated in the MG again, he saw the object he was carrying in his clenched hand. "I've still got the creep's book." Dix made it back to him. Frank said, "I don't feel like going back in there." "Well, we're not going too far away. He knows where they are." Frank looked doubtful. "What makes you think so?" The way he looked when he asked him. He seemed like he'd seen them all right. Frank sat silently for a moment, making no move to start the car. "He thinks something has happened to Lisa and Debbie," he said finally. "Sure I do. Don't you?" Greg scowled in the direction of the inn door, which had opened to let out an elderly couple who looked insecurely at them for a moment, then walked slowly on down the sidewalk. "But what can we do?" Frank scratched thoughtfully at his t-shirt. "How could we find out? We can't go to the police without any more evidence than a candy wrapper." "Okay, how about this? We know they've got to catch home, right? They've got to catch the plane back in Bucharest tomorrow morning to go back home, right? We don't have to catch our plane home until Friday. That gives us 3 days. Why don't we drive to Bucharest and go out to the airport tomorrow morning to see if they're meeting the plane? If they're not there, then we'll know for sure. They'll probably be there and mad at us for chasing after them." Greg shook his head. "I've got a funny feeling they won't." Greg started the motor and pulled the MG away from the curb. "Okay, but even if they're not on the plane, I don't know what we can do to find them. Come back here and find out what this guy knows that he's not telling." Greg looked through the pages of the book he was holding, and in a moment he was leaning back, reading it. Frank took his eyes away from the road He glanced at him. "What does it say? How about reading it out loud?" Greg read aloud, slowly at first, and then faster, as his eyes adjusted to the faded handwriting. "The true history of Vlad Dracula is being written on these pages. It is my wish that this account be published so as to disprove many inaccurate, vicious stories of my life and activities being spread throughout the world. As these pages will prove, I am a man, not a monster, bred of noble stock, and a prince in my own right, but forced to endure such sufferings as are beyond belief. What I've written here will speak for itself." And it's signed Vlad Dracula. Dracula's supposed to have written that book himself? Frank whistled. "That's a switch. It's been here around for a few hundred years, I guess. Maybe he's had a lot of time to write a book," Greg said. Vampiring probably isn't his only full-time job. I wonder if the Transylvanians really believe there was a Dracula. Sure, my uncle told me Dracula was a real person. All right. Frank looked interested. "Yeah, well, the book was written by that Dracula. It might be worth a fortune. Go on and read it." And so Greg continued to read aloud as it follows. Blood red, the light of the setting sun stained the snowy peaks of the Carpathian Mountains and tinted the clouds that trailed ceaselessly through the valleys. 9 horsemen traveled the winding road that rose from the gentle hills below them and through the jagged rocks of the mountain pass. A chill wind came up, carrying the scent of pine woods. Several of the men pulled their sheepskin coats closer around their necks and looked anxiously at the darkening shadows. And as their leader urged his horse forward up a steep grande, one of them broke away from the others and raced to overtake him. "Vlad, wait a minute." Blood red, the light of the setting sun stained the snowy peaks of the Carpathian Mountains and tinted the clouds that trailed ceaselessly through the valleys. 9 horsemen traveled the winding road that rose from the gentle hills below them through the jagged rocks of the mountain pass. A chill wind came up, carrying the scent of pine woods. Several of the men pulled the sheepskin coats closer around their necks and looked anxiously at the darkening shadows as the leader urged his horse forward up a steep grande. One of them broke away from the others and raced to overtake him. "Vlad, wait a minute." The dark, bearded man reined in his horse and turned his head slightly. He wore a fur hat that covered his ears and his dark brown eyes. glittered under his heavy brows. "What is it, Tattoo?" "The men are tired. Let's stop here for tonight and go on to Sisora at dawn." Vlad looked impassively into the weary eyes of the haggard face. "We will continue on tonight, but it's cold, lad. We can make a fire in the meadow under the trees. We can rest and eat and warm ourselves." "No. Magna was nearly ready to give birth when we left for Nuremberg. I want to see the baby that is waiting for me at home. We will go tonight. We've been here for so many weeks. What difference would one more night make?" Tattoo rubbed his hands together for warmth. But Vlad could feel the heat of sudden anger rushing through him. "You dare to argue with me, Tattoo? You've forgotten so soon who I am. Such a short memory could be dangerous." He watched the shadow of fear cross the other man's face and heard the bigness that suddenly softened his voice. "Vlad, don't move. I haven't forgotten." "I'm glad of that," Vlad said impatiently. He prodded his horse forward once more. Tattoo rode beside him, and Vlad felt his anger easing. After all, they had been companions for so many years. He could understand how Tattoo still looked on him as simply his friend. But soon Vlad would be the ruler, and Tattoo would be the subject. Even now, he and his small band of noblemen were returning from a trip to Nuremberg, where he had been chosen to be a candidate for the Prince of Wallachia in this year, 1431, by the Hungarian king, Emperor Sigmund, son of Luxembourg, and honored him further by being invested with the Order of the Dragon. He slipped a hand in under his sheepskin to let his fingers run across the front of his tunic, where he would wear his special symbol, a dragon hanging on a cross with its wings spread and its back cut in two, a design that would remind all Christians that Christ conquered the Prince of Hell by his death and resurrection. The road had leveled off a little in its upward climb through the pass, and the dark firs stood out sharply on the snowy hillside. "We'll be home before morning," Vlad said, and Tattoo answered him with a nod. "Unless it snows." "It's not going to snow. Look how clear the skies are." In the deepening twilight, the mountains ahead of them and around them seemed etched against the sky, their snowy caps glowing, the greens and browns of trees and grass patching the deep blues and purples of the rocky slopes. And ahead they could hear rushing water, and as they turned a bend, they saw the white and silver path of
icy waterfall emptying into a rocky pool not far from the trail.
Tattoo shouted to be heard over the roar. The peasants in Tigru Merez said it had been snowing there for the past 3 days. Vlad smiled faintly to himself. Tattoo had always been a warrior, a coward. Relax. Enjoy the beauty of Transylvania. It's been many weeks since we've seen it. They rode on silently after that until the sky had become a dark blue background for thousands of ice-shard stars, and a full moon rose above them. For a long time, the only sound Vlad heard was a gentle throb of the horse's hooves on the path, a rhythmic thudding that could almost lull his tired body to sleep, if it were not for the cold wind that stung him every time the group left the shelter of rocks or trees. But now his ears caught another sound, not far away. He turned to Tattoo, still riding next to him. Was that howling? Did you hear it? Tattoo's face shone fear back at him in the gloom. Not wolves. It wasn't a question. And the answer they didn't need came with a long, mournful wail, a short distance to the right of them, that was soon lost in the yipping and howling of others behind them. Their horses reared, and Vlad could hear frightened whinnies from the horses following them. And then, without urging, the 9 horsemen were riding up the trail as fast as they could go down the steep, dark path. Over the uneven road, almost flying through the night, the horses ran in panic. The howling of the wolves encircled them, seeming to come closer and closer. Vlad was no longer leading the group, for 3 of his men were short way ahead of him, galloping wildly. Looking back for a moment, he saw Tattoo just a short distance behind him, but he couldn't see the others. They must have been left behind by the faster riders. He hoped they could still outdistance the wolves. The road was narrowing now as they ran between rock walls, the horses snorting and panting, and then they were in the open again, mounting a steep grande, and Tattoo's horse was once more beside him. Vlad tried to speed his horse, but the weary animal was pushing himself to the limit and could go no faster. There, just ahead, was the crest of the hill, and as they reached it, Vlad saw the open meadow ahead of them, and the ghostly white shapes of the wolves that had gathered there to wait for them. Both horses stopped, shivering. Tatul swore in the darkness. Vlad looked around, but there was no way to go past the wolves. Pacing in the restless semicircle, starved from the months of hard winter they had endured, ready to tear the warm flesh of anything that could catch. The horsemen and the animals froze in an anxious tableau, watching each other now. Now, Vlad could hear the other horses coming up behind them. The wolves moved then, loping swiftly toward them, white fangs flashing. Vlad answered coldly. He had no regrets about Tatul. He was a weak and cowardly fool who should have obeyed his order to turn back instead of letting his horse run away with him. If we had stopped to rescue him from the wolves, we would have given them a chance to attack us there, or catch up with one of us later on the road. Which one would have slowed his horse by loading it down with another rider? There was silence, and some shook their heads. Then he went on. Consider that Tatul gave his life to save ours. You could see the sorrow in their faces. Tatul had been well liked. Or let them handle their feelings in their own way. It was better for a prince to be feared than loved. He turned his tired horse through the carved wooden gates of Sisora and let it find its own way back through the familiar winding streets. When he saw the lighted lamp in his front doorway, Vlad knew Magna would be waiting for him. She always seemed to know when he would be arriving back home from his many journeys, though he didn't know how she knew. As soon as he stepped in front of the house, the door opened and servants ran out, one to lead the horse away to the stables and two more to help the tired traveler into the house, where his wife was waiting to kiss him and lead him to sit by the fire. Smiling, she filled a bowl with porridge from a pot at the fireplace. Welcome back, my husband. The firelight glinted on her long, loose red hair and her huge brown eyes. Vlad laid the steaming bowl aside. The baby? We rode all night so that I could be home sooner to see it. Magna smiled, went to the doorway. Anna, she called, bring the baby here for his father to see. In a few moments, Anna was there, holding a white, wrapped infant. Magda took the child from her and knelt beside her husband, holding it so she could see the baby's face. It was sleeping, pink-cheeked and peaceful, a dark curl lying on his forehead, its lashes black against his ivory skin. A boy? Magna nodded. A perfect baby boy, without a name as yet, of course. But I call him Vlad. Vlad? Yes, he shall be called Vlad the Third. He gazed at the baby for a long time, then took him from Magda's arms and put his face down against him, squeezing him hard in a sudden burst of love and pride. The baby woke and wailed. He held it out then, smiling, to Magda, who handed it to the waiting nurse. Here, Anna, feed him, and he will sleep again. His father will want to see him again in the morning. Vlad watched the nurse leave with the crying infant, and my oldest son, Marcia. How is the child? He is well, but not too fond of a squealing little brother. Suddenly Vlad realized how tired he was, and how hungry. He ate his porridge, while Magda poured him wine and asked him questions about his journey. She seemed especially anxious to hear every detail of a ceremony at the court at Nuremberg. She was so simple and childlike, his tall, beautiful wife. She had not been born of royalty as he had, but was of noble birth, the daughter of a boyar. But she had never been outside of Transylvania. Who is there? She asked eagerly. Was the emperor's wife at the ceremony? Is she so beautiful? What kind of furs and jewels did she wear? Wait, that's too many questions to answer tonight. I've got to sleep soon, but I can tell you a little. He smiled fondly at her. There were many nobles of Hungary, and Barbara von Eli was there with Emperor Sigmund, and there were bishops and knights. Here, he let his sheepskin slide from his shoulders lad nodded. As a member of the order, I had to make a lot of vows. To fight the infidel, to defend Sigmund and his family, and to keep the memory of the condemnation of heretics. He pointed to the insignia, and because of this, my boyars are now calling me Dracula. Dracula? Magna frowned. The devil? No, of course not. Dracula the dragon. Oh, Magna still looked doubtful, but smiled faintly. Vlad stood and stretched. And my new son, my second son, who bears my name, he will be called the son of the dragon. He will be known as Dracula. Greg stopped reading and looked at Frank. So that's what Dracula